Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with a disastrously delusional American president making up stories about negotiating with the enemy as he tries to get out of a trap he set for himself by going to war against Iran without considering the consequences. Joining us to discuss how our reality TV president is unable to deal with reality while profiting from manipulating the markets is Aslı Bâli, a professor of law at the Yale Law School, past president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America, and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Previously, she served as the founding faculty director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law and is the former director of the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies. She has an article at Equator magazine, Killing Diplomacy. Then we'll examine how Trump and Putin are working together to help re-elect Hungary's kleptocratic despot Orban, and speak with Kim Scheppele, a professor of sociology and international affairs at Princeton University. She lived in Budapest doing research at the Constitutional Court of Hungary and teaching at both the University of Budapest and at Central European University, and studied the emergence of constitutional law in Russia and Hungary, living in both places for extended periods. She's the author of 9/11, The Rise of Global Anti-Terrorism Law. Then finally, as Trump-friendly billionaires buy up our media, we will speak with the former CEO of a company now owned by the Ellisons, which is joining with Fox, Sinclair, Tegna, and Nexstar to create the equivalent of state media as a mouthpiece for an American dictator. Joining us is Tom Freston, a co-founder of MTV and the former CEO of Viacom, which includes CBS, Paramount Pictures, and many media and publishing properties. After launching a successful clothing export company out of Afghanistan and India in the 1970s, Freston transitioned into the media landscape, helping found MTV, bringing it to international fame in more than 150 countries. Before his Viacom roles, he ran MTV Networks for 17 years, overseeing Nickelodeon, VH1, Comedy Central, and other legendary networks. He currently serves as board chair of the One Campaign, an anti-poverty advocacy organization focusing on Africa, and we will discuss his latest book, Unplugged: Adventures from MTV to Timbuktu. And before we begin with Trump having bombed 7 countries and started a war against Iran, while at home his ICE thugs terrorize and break up families, murdering American citizens in the process, the need to rid the country of the deeply unpopular Trump kakistocracy and his clown car cabinet could not be more urgent. But these crooks and criminals would do anything to stay in power as their billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media and the mob boss intimidates Republican politicians. Only people power can beat money power, and we need all hands on deck as we continue to do our part, delivering a daily public service, providing the facts and evidence to inform the majority of what they are up against and how to win back our country, our decency, and the respect of the community of nations. You can help save America's 250-year-old democracy by making a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org, and thank you. And joining us now is Aslı Bâli, who's a professor of law at Yale Law School and the past president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America, and she has an article at Equator magazine, Killing Diplomacy. Welcome to Background Briefing, Aslı Bâli.
Thank you so much for having me, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And it's not as if Trump is killing diplomacy. He is actually inventing diplomacy that's not actually happening. He's talking about a gift from Iran that's coming through and what a wonderful thing is, and we're talking to the right people. And the Iranians are saying, no, you're not talking to any of us. So he has got himself into such a jam that he's making stuff up. But the other side of the story, which is totally criminal, is that this sort of zigzagging and whipsawing is a great opportunity to manipulate the markets. And I'm pretty sure that he and his family have found a way to make a killing.
Yeah. I mean, it is not surprising that states move markets as part of war. And in this particular war, but also just in a war in a context of a global economy, it's not only fought on the battlefield, but sort of inside price systems. And what I think the Trump administration is doing is engaging in, again, something that we would expect, disinformation propaganda in the context of a war. But in this case, not only with the idea of producing deterrence or throwing off the adversary, but rather deliberately designed in order to move financial markets because there is so much at stake. And of course, war is the perfect environment for speculation and opportunism. And the question that one should really ask when looking at this behavior is who profits, right? So one thing that is clear and that is being made clear at this moment is that war is a mechanism for reshaping political economy, real political economy, like the real economy, productive capacity, actual energy flows, et cetera, at the moment in the Persian Gulf, but also the paper economy, the financial markets. And war doesn't just destroy value, it also redistributes it. And so the question is, who is profiting from this? And of course, the Iranians are keenly aware, as are any kind of sophisticated consumers in the US at this point, that major changes in military strategy are taking place after markets close. Major policy announcements are being made on Monday mornings just before markets open with a clear intention to not only alter what's happening in the sort of real world kinetics of this war, but also in the paper economy, like how financial instruments and prediction markets are intersecting with the strategy that's being developed. And this is all happening. And again, I'm saying it's not new, although it's greatly accelerated at the moment, but it's also being made totally explicit in a way that the Iranians have named. The Iranians themselves say we discount the messaging that comes from the White House and that comes from Trump because he's obviously trying to move markets and there isn't anything to what he's saying. So in a universe where we have essentially the financialization of everything, and you now have tradable instruments in oil futures and options, shipping and insurance exposure, currency fluctuation, and even now geopolitical prediction markets, geopolitical events can be monetized. And there's also now a level of speed to this where news is released and algorithms in the financial markets react in milliseconds and prices jump before people can even process the information that's been made available. And so knowing anything slightly earlier, being slightly better informed means you can capture outsized gains. And the volatility that war creates produces endless opportunities for this: sharp price swings, uncertainty, rapid reversals. So volatility is itself a profit potential. And so war is always going to be fertile ground for this. But when you have leadership that personally seeks profit in these moments, then you have this kind of new way of thinking of what insider information actually means. Anybody close to the regime, let's call it, the Trump administration, is going to have sooner, faster, clearer access to information about the really otherwise chaotic policy shifts that the administration is undertaking. And more, so there's uneven information distribution and enormous concentration of information in government, military planners, intelligence-linked actors, et cetera, who benefit from information asymmetry to pursue profit, potentially. And then on top of that, even in contexts where information is transparently made public, you have sophisticated actors that are better able to read signals or position themselves ahead of a consensus. So markets are also responding to this, even those not in those inner circles around the Trump administration. So basically, it's a circumstance in which financialization and speculation in the context of war are dramatically escalated and accelerated for the purposes that enrich some. I mean, it really is a redistribution of wealth in the midst of war, and it's remarkable.
Well, I think, Aslı, you have to add to that. There is a conduit for criminality now known as crypto.
Right. Yes. I mean, so again, this, it's also the fact that we have new vehicles. I mean, so it's always been the case that geopolitical events are directly tied to, financial instruments, but the proliferation of those kinds of instruments and the currencies in which this kind of speculation can take place is a further added element that allows, it makes it much more difficult to trace movements. And in any case, as I say, when we talk about insider information, we normally mean something very different in a very different context. When you talk about insider trading, we're talking normally about non-public material information that is an idea that's developed in the private sector, corporate markets. In a war context, that means, something entirely different. Advanced knowledge of strikes, ceasefires, sanctions decisions, infrastructure, all of those things are in the hands of government actors who themselves invest, as you say, in cryptocurrencies, indeed sponsor cryptocurrencies. And even the smallest timing advantage can matter because it moves markets immediately when the information becomes public. So, of course, they can be making money hand over fist in this environment. And it's very, very difficult to trace, if one of the guiding sort of principles of a condition like this one, where there's a political economy in which individuals and groups and institutions are able to profit from producing insecurity, then the answer is follow the money. But the introduction of crypto makes that infinitely more difficult to do.
But in terms of Trump's day job, apart from making money for himself and his family, his day job is he's president of the United States. He's leader of the free world. He's clearly somebody that's trapped in his own delusion. I mean, obviously, his son-in-law Jared and Witkoff, the real estate guy, along with Netanyahu, talked him into this thing. And he thought, and Hegseth said, oh, it'll be a cakewalk. We'll bomb them back to the Stone Age. He's trapped now. He's clearly trapped. And because the price of oil and how it's affecting the markets and affecting the Republican Party, and he didn't even think that they were going to close the Straits of Hormuz, which is just mind-boggling. This is what's really going on, isn't it? That finally we have, at least you think that most of America's waking up to the fact that they have a catastrophe as a leader.
Yes, I mean, there are two sort of strategic failures. There's the one that you named, which is, the failure to understand the very, very predictable, first order consequences of the course that the United States has decided to pursue for whatever reasons. And we're not given clear, strategic justification for the path that's been chosen. We're given a, inchoate mix of different kinds of reasons depending on who the speaker is. And in the case of Trump, really his explanation varies from one moment to the next within a single sentence even. So we don't know actually, but like whatever it was, it's a huge miscalculation, and a miscalculation of something that was not just predictable, but literally predicted by his own intelligence community. I mean, the defense intelligence analysis around Iran predicted all of these things in the first Trump administration back in 2019. And I mean, none of that has changed. If anything, all of the vulnerabilities that were assessed then have only intensified because Iran has different motivations now after having been struck in the 12-day war in June, and still the industrial capacity to produce drones and so forth. So, being shocked by something that is entirely predictable and has been predicted by your own apparatus is its own sort of strategic miscalculation. But a different one, which I think you're also suggesting, is the fundamental miscalculation about what the U.S. domestic public has an appetite for. And here it's partly because the second order effects, not just the first order effects that you will predictably produce a situation that internally requires escalation, that once you engage in these massive strikes and you kill leadership figures, you have no choice but to escalate. And in a circumstance where you're escalating, you are basically shifting to a terrain in which Iran has a series of very serious advantages, like a capacity to trigger choke points, a capacity to, just through the very fact of its incentive, the incentive scheme the United States itself has produced for Iran to retaliate, there are going to be reputational consequences that undermine insurability of global shipping, that Iran has access to low-cost tools that it can manufacture cheaply and repeatedly use, and that's going to involve depleting much more expensive defensive technology in the hands of the United States and Israel, and maybe most importantly, that Iran will stretch the conflict across time and geography because its asymmetric advantage deepens. So all of these things should have been clear, were made clear, I'm just repeating things that are said in the US government's own assessments of what would happen if Iran were to be struck. But in addition, the second order effects, of course, are to not just global energy markets, but energy sits upstream of so many different factors, right? And we're basically now in a situation in which you have globalized interdependence that is driving up prices across every sector that is downstream of energy, so food, fertilizer, all forms of shipping, just everything having to do with global supply chains. And to not have anticipated that and the price spikes and insurance rises and shipping hesitancy and so forth that would be triggered is remarkable. And then to have not anticipated the impact that would have on the domestic appetite for continuing the conflict. So all of these are strategic errors. There's a strategic error in assessing Iran as an adversary, right? We've, I think, discussed previously on this show that the United States under Trump is a power that only wants to punch down, but it miscalculated the degree to which Iran is a very different actor than some of the other weak adversaries that the U.S. has been willing to attack under Trump. It's a quite different regime, constituted very differently, with a very different industrial base, a very different kind of economy, and resources of resilience and endurance that are incomparable, and also incomparable at least to places like Venezuela and Cuba. And also the model of will knock out the leader and will basically take control is one that is, this may have been the kind of Mossadegh idea, but that was when you had a pliant Shah and a military at the disposal of the U.S. as an ally, and now instead you have a decentralized, deeply entrenched regime capable of withstanding these kinds of decapitation strikes. So it's a misjudgment of the adversary, but it's also a misjudgment of the American public's appetite for this. And that, I think, ultimately, the combination of those two strategic errors are going to have consequences that may finally represent a domestic constraint on the otherwise totally unconstrained resort to coercion by this government.
So is there any way that Trump can get his irons out of the fire here along with Netanyahu? For example, the Saudis and the UAE apparently are taking steps towards joining this war. At least that's what the Wall Street Journal is reporting. I'm not sure that's true, although we're told that MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince, is on the phone all the time to Trump saying, finish the job, finish the job. And I'm sure Netanyahu is doing the same. So is there any way they can pull this off? As far as I can see, this is an unmitigated disaster, and the hole is just being dug deeper.
So the Gulf and Israel are very differently situated with respect to this war for all kinds of reasons, including, of course, Israel initiated this war, and Israel's goals are also different than and divergent from those of the United States. So let's disentangle the Netanyahu piece from the MBS piece. But in the case of what's at least been reported, what seems to be the case with respect to the Gulf states is that they are expressing a private escalation preference while publicly retaining a posture of de-escalation and claiming that they want this war to end. And there is a certain logic to this, right? Because Saudi Arabia and the UAE might prefer prolonging the war on the basis of three kind of overlapping strategic calculations on their part. First, the fear of an incomplete outcome, that if this war ends now and this regime survives and retains asymmetric capabilities, that it will be now further emboldened. That's part one. Part two, there's a logic that there's a window of vulnerability right now that while Iran is under heavy military pressure and has already been partially degraded, continuing might be a way to, seize upon a rare moment where the long-term balance in the Gulf can be shifted in the favor of the Arab states. And finally, that they are seeking now a regional order reconfiguration in order to reduce the threat to Gulf infrastructure, shift the regional balance back in their favor, and stabilize, at least in theory, the conditions for investment and energy exports to resume. So they're kind of embracing the short-term instability of continuing the war as a path to trying to achieve some of the preconditions for long-term stability. Now, this is a completely mistaken calculation, if it's correct, that this is the position they're taking, but they don't have any good alternative positions to take, really, because what the Gulf states have wanted is stability for capital accumulation. But at the same time, they've been, for a long time, aligned with a U.S.-led security architecture in the region. And this is not the first time that security architecture has itself been the source of instability. So what the Gulf states had tried to do previously in order to manage risk was to, move towards greater hedging, diversify where they could, have a partial strategic realignment. They had tried to de-escalate with Iran, diversify economically, and minimize their geopolitical risk. When they did de-escalate with Iran, notably, it was through the mediation of China, right? So they were taking the steps to try to stabilize their regional position after the lesson they took away from the first Trump administration's unwillingness to come to their defense when they suffered Iranian strikes in retaliation for then U.S. coercion against Iran, they decided to recalibrate. But now that option is no longer available because what has happened, the kind of catastrophic strikes that have been undertaken against Iran now make it impossible for them to preserve that kind of ambivalence where they remain aligned with a U.S. strategic architecture, but at the same time try to de-escalate and manage risk. And so under these new circumstances, it's not surprising that they're finding themselves really confronting the contradiction of their position and having to pursue a different model, which is trying to eliminate the source of risk. Now, paradoxically, this might mean that instead of the regional approach that they had adopted at the end of the first Trump administration, which is a détente with Iran and some degree of regional economic integration to stabilize the Gulf, so a kind of political economy of regional architecture overseen by the Gulf itself rather than purely through the American-led security architecture. Now they're being driven back to a kind of Abraham Accords posture where they have no choice but to double down on the relationship with the U.S., and that drives them into the arms of Israel. But actually, Israel, I think, has engaged in a fundamental miscalculation of its own, turning to its position, which is a maximalist set of goals to not degrade Iran's capabilities, but to destroy, it would seem, the regime, and not just the regime, but to induce state collapse. And this has been a strategy that they've employed with their immediate neighbors, obviously in Gaza. This strategy of pure devastation, just only destruction, is something that, again, maybe like the United States, Israel, with its, near abroad, quote unquote, successes in its own book, has generated hubris. So just as the Trump administration may have had wind in their sails from both the 12-day June war and Iran's responsive restraint to that war and the Venezuela decapitation effort in January, that they believed that they could just engage in another spectacular use of force and produce a short-term, immediate benefit that distracts from the many domestic problems they were facing. That was a fundamental miscalculation. And Israel may imagine that, given what it's been given license to do in Gaza and the West Bank, and now increasingly seizing Syrian territory and Lebanese territory, that it could generalize this model. But the idea that Israel can, quote unquote, mow the lawn, that either it has the coercive capacity on its own or with a limited U.S. commitment to not only destroy, but keep on the ground, on its knees, a country the size of Iran, with the geography of Iran at a distance from Israel that Iran is located and situated on the Persian Gulf with control over a choke point, that it's going to be able to durably sustain that outcome is insane. They can't, and nor can they mow the lawn and keep coming back and employing more and more coercion to force a country the size with the sophisticated economy of the population of and the geography of Iran, keep it on its knees. Like, these are not sustainable goals. So the maximalism is totally self-defeating in the Israeli context for Israel proper, but it's also a very different calculation. The Gulf's goal has never been destroy Iran and leave a failed state on their borders with 95 million people and imagine that can be contained. So Israel's, whatever strategy Israel imagines itself to be pursuing at the moment, it is one of enormous and, I think, absolutely reckless destructiveness, but also a logic that will ultimately redound against its interests in the medium term, and one that depends on an American guarantee that is absolutely feckless. On top of, it's a totally risky gamble that they've taken, but also a deeply destructive and irresponsible one. But it also depends on an actor that it's shown itself to be completely inconstant, namely the United States. And so I think Israel has made a horrible strategic error. The United States has miscalculated dramatically strategically. And the Gulf and Iran, these are not actors that chose this war in any way or are responsible. But of course, they also are facing strategic defeat in their own realms. Iran, because its efforts to put in place a deterrent to prevent this worst possible outcome, that deterrent failed. It's not clear how any actor can deter irrational and reckless adversaries. But anyway, that's certainly Iran is going to absorb the greatest cost here in terms of infrastructure and its population. But also the Gulf, again, having invited none of this, is now in this terrible position. And so they don't have good options. They're doubling down at the moment, but it's, more, I would imagine, out of desperation than anything else.
Well, Aslı, Bâli, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Aslı Bâli, who's a professor of law at the Yale Law School. She's the past president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And previously, she served as the founding faculty director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law and is the former director of the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies and has an article at Equator magazine, Killing Diplomacy. We're going to take a brief station break, back examining how Trump and Putin are working together to help re-elect Hungary's kleptocratic despot, Viktor Orban.
Take all the leaders from around the world, put them together in a great big ring, televise it as the lowest show on earth, and let them fight like hell to see who's king. Oh, hey, gather up the pieces when the fight is done, then you'll find out living really can be fun.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Scheppele, who's a professor of sociology and international affairs at Princeton University. She lived in Budapest doing research at the Constitutional Court of Hungary and teaching at both the University of Budapest and at Central European University, where she was a founding director of the program in Gender and Culture. She studied the emergence of constitutional law in Hungary and Russia, living in both places for extended periods, and is the author of 9/11, The Rise of Global Anti-Terrorism Law. Welcome to Background Briefing, Scheppele.
Nice to be back.
Well, thanks for joining us. And on Monday in Budapest, you had all of the right-wing leaders coming from across Europe to help campaign for Viktor Orban. And preceding that, of course, you had the Secretary of State, after he did the Munich Security Conference, showing up in Budapest to lend U.S. support for Orban, who's in a tight re-election race, and he's, 10, 12 points behind in the polls. Donald Trump has weighed in and saying what a great guy he is. He hopes he wins, and I hope he wins big. But the weird part and the shameful part is that the United States government and the Russian government are working together to get this guy re-elected. At the same time, he's holding up $92 billion that the EU want to give to Ukraine. So what side are we on?
I think we're on both sides, as so many occasions right now under this government. So yeah, this is an unusual meeting of minds. It turns out now we're just a couple of weeks out from the Hungarian election. Viktor Orban is somewhere between, there's a pollster called Median that just came out with a new poll, and it shows Orban about 16 points behind among the general public. But if you look at the people who were absolutely certain to vote, Orban's more than 20 points down. So, it really looks like Peter Magyar and his TISA party are going to coast to victory. So, it turns out, however, that Orban is part of the General International League of Autocrats, as I call it. And unfortunately, in that particular league, the U.S. and Russia are more or less on the same side. So Orban has long been friends with Vladimir Putin. When Putin was ostracized after his invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Viktor Orban actually had just been to Moscow a couple of weeks before that invasion, and he's been making political hay out of the idea that because he can talk to Putin and he can talk to all sides, Orban will then be the peacemaker. Putin has reciprocated by doing a lot of things to help Orban stay in power. Just in this last week, we've learned two rather stunning things. One is that Putin sent a team of 3 people from the sort of troll farm in St. Petersburg to be seconded to the Russian embassy in Budapest, where they are helping Orban with a disinformation campaign coming to you straight from Moscow. So that's factoid 1 that's been disturbing. But factoid 2 is that it came out this week due to some really fabulous investigative journalists in Hungary that Peter Szijjártó, who is Hungary's foreign minister, has been routinely phoning up the foreign minister of Russia, Mr. Lavrov, after every closed-door EU meeting. So it's not just that Orban's holding up the money to Ukraine, It said he's actively leaking information out of those meetings by phone calls to the Russian foreign minister. So it's pretty clear that Russia and Hungary have been joined at the hip for some time. It's not just for the election campaign. And Putin is all in on having Orban succeed. Okay, now that's part one. Part two, which is also a little bit funny, right, is that Viktor Orban impressed Donald Trump during Trump's first term in office. I think Trump understands an aspirational autocrat when he sees one, and Orban is certainly that. So Trump and his minions have actually been very involved in working closely with Viktor Orban to design Project 2025, which was the blueprint for a Trump second term. So Orban's people helped Trump. Orban endorsed Trump before the election. Orban's plan, Orban's assisted blueprint is now a guiding document that's, sort of governing what the Trump administration does. And in exchange, although, Trump never does anything really reciprocally, but, Trump probably sees it in his interest to endorse Viktor Orban, to send the Secretary of State and the Vice President, I'm sorry. And then there's also now, in addition to the meeting of all the right-wing leaders from across Europe on Monday, there was a mini CPAC meeting in Budapest on Sunday. I call it a CPACette because it was tiny compared to prior meetings, but still, this is part of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party's effort to see their buddies in Budapest. A lot of people in the MAGA circles have gone through training at Orban's English language Danube Institute based in Budapest. And there are just lots of ways in which the Trump circles and the Orban circles are intertwined, mutually supporting each other. So yes, but Orban is being supported by both Putin and by Trump.
Well, just to follow up on the foreign minister of Hungary, he's made 16 official visits to Moscow since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, most recently on March the 4th when he met with Putin. But what Trump and Orban have in common is that they're both kleptocrats and they're both feathering their nests, and their families are getting rich and their cronies are getting rich. And that was all exposed in the documentary that the Hungarian people were able to see in spite of the media control, because Trump is following Orban's playbook and taking over the media and having his billionaire buddies buy up the media, which is what's happening in this country. It already happened, of course, in Hungary, but somehow or other it would seem that a lot of people in Hungary have learned about the incredible corruption. Now, not only is this guy a despot, he's also a crook.
Yes, Orban, the crook in chief. So yeah, there's a class of aspirational autocrats or actual dictators whose primary motivation is personal graft. And certainly Orban's in that category. Certainly Trump's in that category. Putin's slightly more complicated because I think he actually had some ideas about sort of restoring the Russian Empire and so on. He's not, only in it for the corruption, although he's probably also in it for the corruption. So one of the tricky things is, well, how do you use your position as, the president or prime minister of a country to enrich yourself? And Orban perfected the high art of stealing through government contracts, which is something we're seeing in spades now in the Trump administration. That was probably also what was going on in Russia, but that's much less transparent, so it's hard to see. Orban has managed to monetize pretty much every aspect of the prime minister's job. And I'm sure that's something that Trump actually thinks is just a grand idea, and he's looking for clues on how to do that.
Well, I think it's happening with the massive amount of money that they've given to DHS and particularly to ICE, $75 billion, because these big warehouses that they're buying up, their government is paying 7-8 times more than what the buildings are worth and what they're listed at. So somebody's making massive kickbacks.
Yeah, so Trump is the real estate guy. So likely, I'm not surprised he decides to make his money off buildings. Orban tends to steal about 25 to, a quarter to a third of the money off EU contracts, which go to his cronies. And one of the interesting things you can see in the run up to the Hungarian election now is that Orban is a kind of, I call him a belt and suspenders guy, right? He has to be prepared for winning the election or stealing it if necessary, but he also prepares for losing if he must. And what you see now is that the EU, in reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has decided to put a huge amount of money into building up European defense. So the next big tranches of EU money, and Orban has lived by stealing EU money, next big tranche of EU money is going to go into defense. So in the last year, Orban and his compliant defense minister have been busily privatizing the whole defense sector so that if that money comes into Hungary, even if it comes in under a TISA is the competing party, even if it comes in under a TISA government, will still wind up getting into the channeled into the hands of Orban cronies. So they're preparing to grift off the top of the EU money, because it's all going to come in and go to defense, and the whole defense sector will be dominated by Orban's buddies. So, that's the kind of thing Trump is also very likely to be doing. I don't know if Trump learned those things from Orban, but they're certainly in the same on the same wavelength.
Right. Well, Trump will end up building his own battleships, right?
Yeah, the funny thing about building battleships is that every Navy guy will tell you that these things are like sitting targets. The future of the Navy is small speed, invisibility, not big hulking things that you can sink with a single missile. Yes.
Right.
But that would be a fitting end for a Trump ship built like that.
Indeed. But just to touch on Russian intelligence interference and trying to help Orban, and the Washington Post is reporting that both the SVR, foreign intelligence, and GRU, military intelligence, are actively in there, and that there was even a plot or a plan to stage an assassination attempt to help bolster Orban's poll numbers. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say that much of that was uncovered by some really amazing Hungarian investigative journalists. And if you want to support independent journalism in Hungary, there's something called Direct 36 with a K, DIREKT 36, and Atlatso, ATLATSCO. They need money. They're the ones doing all the digging that then gets out into the Western press from there. So I got to put in a pitch for my buddies who are the independent journalists. So these independent journalists have actually been, finding out that the Hungarian elections have been penetrated by Russian intelligence, probably at the invitation of the Russian government. What we learned from these hacks over the last few days is that the Hungarian government is spying on the political opposition party and has put itself in control of the communications system the opposition party is using to communicate with itself. But at the same time, somebody is bugging the Hungarian investigative journalists, that the very ones who disclosed the Russian involvement in the Hungarian election. And so in the last couple of days, transcripts from those reporters who uncovered the Russian influence have begun circulating on social media from who knows where. And that's why we don't actually know if it's the Hungarian government bugging them or whether it's the Russian government bugging them, because the point of circulating the transcripts is to tell every source that talks to them, your every word may be public, so don't count on these interviews being off the record. So the creepy thing that's just happened in the last couple of days is that it's just been known, stories broken by András Pető, and also Szabolcs Pányi is the other one. These two have really done an amazing job. But András Pető just released yesterday a big investigation that shows that the Orban government was able to compromise the internal communication system of the opposition party, to bug it, to infiltrate it, and potentially to just shut it down right before the election. At the same time, what they've documented now, because the word came out, is that Szabolcs Pányi and András Pető, their phones had been previously infected with Pegasus. And now it seems like they've been infected again, because in response to the information that Szabolcs Pányi had released and had figured out that the Russian intelligence operatives were working on the Hungarian election, suddenly in social media, they circulate transcripts of calls between Pányi and his sources, showing that Pányi's phone is once again bugged. And that is meant to discourage anyone from talking to him. That just happened yesterday. So, it's really I mean, I just, like I said, I want to support those Hungarian investigative journalists, but also to say that they're doing this at tremendous risk to themselves. And, the Hungarian government has immense targeting and hacking and bugging capacities, but so does Russia. And so I'm wondering actually which side those particular phone taps came from.
So in the last minute then, Kim, it looks as though when you talk about how far ahead the opposition leader is, Magyar, even 20 points, that he's going to win. Can we take comfort in that? Because
No, the election system is so rigged that what most analysts are saying is that Peter Magyar has to be at least 10 and more likely 15 points ahead in the actual election results to get a simple majority in the parliament. That said, if Orban wins only 45% of the vote, he's likely to get a 2/3 majority of the parliament. The significance is that in Hungary, the constitution can be amended with a single 2/3 vote of the unicameral parliament. So if you get a 2/3 majority, you can put yourself above the law. Peter Magyar, there is no scenario in which Peter Magyar, the challenger, will ever get the 2/3. And he will only get a simple majority if he gets 55, or some people say 60% of the vote, because the level playing field, shall we say, is so unlevel that that's what it would take to overcome all the biases built into the Hungarian election system.
Sure,
So,
no.
he's way ahead, but we
Right.
don't know if he's going to
Right.
win.
No wonder the Republicans are following the Hungarian model. I thank you for joining us, Kim Lane Scheppele.
Thank you for paying attention to all this.
And again, I've been speaking with Kim Lane Scheppele, who's a professor of sociology and international affairs at Princeton University. She lived in Budapest doing research at the Constitutional Court of Hungary and teaching at both the University of Budapest and at Central European University, where she was the founding director of the program in Gender and Culture. And she studied the emergence of constitutional law in Hungary and Russia, living in both places for extended periods, and is the author of 9/11, The Rise of Global Anti-Terrorism Law. We're going to take a brief station break. We'll be back as Trump-friendly billionaires buy up our media. We'll speak with the former CEO of a company now owned by the billionaire Ellisons and Son. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Tom Freston, a co-founder of MTV and the former CEO of Viacom. After launching a successful clothing company out of Afghanistan and India in the 1970s, Freston transitioned into the media landscape, helping found MTV and bringing it to international fame in more than 150 countries. Before his Viacom roles, he ran MTV Networks for 17 years, overseeing Nickelodeon, VH1, Comedy Central, and other legendary networks. He currently serves as board chair of the One Campaign, an anti-poverty advocacy organization focusing on Africa, and his latest book is Unplugged, Adventures from MTV to Timbuktu. Welcome to Background Briefing, Tom Freston.
Nice to be here, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, Tom. And let's talk about your book, and we'll talk later about the media landscape, having been the head of Viacom, which is now owned by the Ellisons, who are also buying up Warner's and CNN, etc. Because it's a great read, and it's really well written, and it covers an extraordinary span. You start out, you get your MBA, then you bartend your way across the United States and the Caribbean, which gives you the travel bug, which obviously has ruled your life in a way. Then you had a brief stint in corporate America in advertising, the pinnacle of which was you got the Charmin toilet paper account, and then you decided to take a different path, cross the Sahara Desert, end up in Afghanistan and India. You stayed there for 8 years, launching the Hindu Kush fashion company, and just fast forward to the present, where you're working with Bono on the One campaign to basically make up for the cruelty of Trump and Musk in closing down USAID in what Bill Gates described as the richest man in the world, killing the world's poorest children. So why are you more comfortable in a souk in Morocco than in the C-suite on Wall Street?
Well, first of all, I've been the board chair for the One campaign since 2007. I didn't just join it. I was there. I've been there 18 years, and we continue to fight for, justice for Africa and fighting on behalf of the world's poorest people. Lately, that's all, you know, been, kind of there's a hole sort of been blown in the normal global health ecosystem by Trump and Musk and the closing down of USAID, et cetera, and a lot of other things. But to your original question, I'm sort of comfortable anywhere. I mean, I've been able to. I was never cut out for sort of mainstream corporate life. I mean, I tasted that a little bit when I worked in the ad agency business. I was fortunate to spend 8 hardscrabble years running my own business in a very frontier markets of the Afghanistan and India of the 70s. And then the bulk of my media career was running MTV networks, starting at the very beginning of a team of 6 that created MTV, but then moving on to Nickelodeon and all those other networks that you mentioned. But that enterprise was always sort of I would left of center. I don't mean that politically, but not a mainstream media business. It was unusual. It was creative. We were kind of dealing in the innovative side of the popular culture with music and comedy, and it was not a straight-laced type of corporation. So I sort of fit perfectly into that. Did I want to be a mainstream Fortune 500 CEO? Not really.
Well, what is it, though, that you seem to love about? I mean, when you were in Afghanistan and India in the 70s, they were incredibly poor countries. Now, Afghanistan, of course, descended into tragedy, which continues to this day. But clearly, you have empathy.
Oh, I have empathy for those people, and I love my days there. People would find it hard to believe what a pleasurable place Afghanistan was in the 70s. They called it then the Golden Age. I mean, they were excitedly thinking, moving towards modernity in a modern age and trying to connect for the first time to the outside world. India was a whole other story, but I find, being there, I was always drawn to sort of the exotic and life outside the mainstream. And I found that being in a place like that, I could live more vividly, and it was more challenging, and trying to find your way in a place where when you really don't know where you are, you certainly notice things with more detail. And they were really, really enjoyable times for me. The hardest work I ever did.
Well, after you got fired by Sumner Redstone, you were obviously pretty shattered by that experience, being CEO of a Fortune 500 company. I know everybody wanted a piece of you then, but you decided to go back to Afghanistan in 2007 in the middle of the war, where you founded Tolo TV with the Australian Afghan. And your book makes it clear that you and your partner did more for Afghanistan than the $2 trillion that the U.S. military poured into that sinkhole. So that leads me to, I guess, what I consider to be the American tragedy is that we don't understand and appreciate our soft power. And, after all, you founded MTV. It was rock and roll that brought down the Berlin Wall. So what's happened to us? Why don't we understand the cultural soft power that the United States has, as opposed to what's happening now, this tragedy in the Gulf, where we're just blowing stuff up?
It's so disturbing. It's remarkable. It's sort of been a classic American affliction. We really don't understand the outside world and the nuances of the outside world. We have very few people who be able to stand in other people's shoes and see how America looks from there. But the advantages of American soft power are legendary. You just look at movies and music and television and all the things in the media entertainment business and how they really sold so well over the years. And then the soft power that we were able to accrue and goodwill, for example, through the PEPFAR program, where we have 25 million people who had HIV on antiretroviral drugs who are walking around now alive who would have been dead from towns where the only growth business was coffin making, and we've just thrown that all out the window. It's really just remarkable. And now the morass that we're in Iran perfectly illustrates it. So I wouldn't say that we don't appreciate it. I mean, I think the current administration doesn't appreciate it. Many people in America don't appreciate it. The whole expenditure for our USAID was 1/3 of 1% of the US budget. It was nothing. And the goodwill we would accrue and the security that would, how that would help our security as a nation were paramount. We've closed down, Voice of America, which, we could be using right now because we used to have a huge listenership in Iran. There was absolutely no reason to do that. American values were things that people around the world saluted, and we seem to be just throwing them out the window right now. It's extremely disturbing.
So let's talk about the media landscape. The company that you were CEO of, Viacom, has obviously been bought by the Ellisons, and now they're buying up Warner Brothers. And there's a lot of more Trump-friendly media billionaires. There's the Nexstar merger with Tegna. That's 250 TV stations, 70% of U.S. households. Add to that the Smith family Sinclair, which has 185 stations. How close do you see us becoming like state TV in terms of, and you've already got Fox, which is kind of the Pravda of the Republican Party?
Well, it certainly seems to be moving in that direction. The new Paramount Warner Brothers merger with CNN now being in play for a company that has already a piece of TikTok. They already have CBS News. They add CNN to the portfolio, plus all the other things that you listed, which was just a partial list, really. On the liberal side of the agenda, there's not nearly that much media support or coverage. Things that have traditionally been, well, I would say, more both side-ish, like PBS or NPR, have been losing their funding. Whereas a lot of these more right-wing outlets that really survive on rage and misinformation seem to be doing pretty well. I just wonder how deep that market can be.
Well, but it's interesting, the way that you grew MTV was through that sort of campaign, I want my MTV, and it became grassroots. And I'm wondering whether the recent examples, for example, of canceling Jimmy Kimmel and the blowback that happened there, which is again the grassroots, is there any way that we could have a kind of grassroots media in this country? Because obviously, as we've made clear, it's heading in the opposite direction, where a few billionaires, and particularly these Silicon Valley types, are going to be ending up controlling the public mouthpiece.
Well, it's a very fragmented media landscape, as you well know, and the gatekeeper status that networks and magazines used to hold has sort of been melted away to a great extent by the advent of digital social media and so forth. But the Jimmy Kimmel example is interesting. Everyone thought the play was about, well, we have to bend the knee to Trump. We don't want to annoy Trump. But the people get a voice in this too. And it was clear that the people were not happy to have somebody that they liked yanked away from them, with no notice in the middle of the night. And they, put a lot of economic damage right onto Disney. So the people were heard. I do believe that that's our really kind of ace in the hole against the domination of state media and the idea that we're going to take all these people off the air. It's not going to go well with people. And you can look at the approval ratings now of Donald Trump. They're now in the mid 30s, down from like what have been the mid 40s, and that's in a rapidly and it's hard to imagine that it's going to get any higher given the implications of the Iran war and so forth. So I do believe the ace in the hole is on the grassroots level. And I believe that maybe another part of that might be the faith community, which, I think if you see this Tallarico character from Texas, the state senator who's running for the Senate seat, he's got a really interesting sort of and persuasive position that might peel away some of the evangelicals who have drifted towards Trump by just promulgating basic Christian values. Like he said, the problem in this country isn't left or right; it's really top or bottom about the inequality of wealth and so forth. But
Right. Well, it's easier for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle.
well, who knows that they're going to heaven, Ian?
Well, so you're making a pitch for a religious left, which is interesting. And that, to my mind, though, I've never understood why in this country liberals are so defensive, because they did all the heavy lifting, ending slavery, bringing about women's rights, human rights, etc., civil rights in particular. So that's what I find extraordinary. And this idea of the liberal media seems to be such a canard because, frankly, the word liberal means open-minded, skeptical. You don't believe the first thing you heard. That is how journalism and journalists should be, as is also the case with intelligence officers. The minute you bring in ideology, the truth gets slanted and tainted. So your job as a journalist or as an intelligence officer is to seek out the truth and to be open-minded and liberal in that sense. So I've never understood why people have been on the back foot over this, because there's no way to satisfy the right-wing claim of the liberal media, because no matter how fair and balanced you try to be, at the end of the day, they still will call you the liberal media.
Well, it's how long can people vote against their own economic interests? I mean, there are some bright lights out there. I mean, just look at the ratings, for example, of what was MSNBC, the readership of the New York Times, and so forth. Some of the remaining bastions of liberal media seem to be doing better than ever. I mean, there seems to be some sort of awakening going on in the country, and that's going to be interesting to see where that goes. I just as an optimist, I have too much faith in the American people to think that we're going to be steamrolled over by the radical right. I don't see that that's going to be a long-standing result of everything that's going on right now.
So you think that, in a way, in November, people power can overcome money power? Because,
well, something that's needed is leadership. I mean, I go back and I think of the resistance in the 70s to the Vietnam War. We had leaders. Now we have no kings. And we also, that means there's no real leaders, nobody really doing anything. If you could point to anybody who's leading the resistance to this, it's comedians. It's Jimmy Kimmel. It's Bill Maher. It's
well,
South Park people and so forth.
Right. And Jon Stewart, who you nurtured, right?
Yeah, well, we nurtured. I mean, I look at the list of the people who got their career on Comedy Central. They got their television career on Comedy Central, and they all, Dave Scheppele, Matt and Trey, the South Park Book of Mormon guys, Jon Stewart, John Oliver, Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel, this whole Bill Maher, the whole line of them are essentially sort of I would say, in the vanguard of resistance to the Trump administration.
So your book is just full of so many extraordinary, you just know everyone who's anyone. And it's very touching at the end where you were with your friend Jimmy Buffett, who was dying, and you describe being around the deathbed and having Paul McCartney sit on the balcony outside his room singing Blackbird to him. I mean, you've had a really gifted life in terms of the people, and that's how you succeeded in corporate America. It seems that you gravitated to the artists and you protected them and nurtured them. And so many people in corporate America seem to feel that artists are a nuisance as opposed to
I think the real power in our society and any society at the end of the day lies with the artists.
Right. Some of the stuff in the book, though, is just amazing. I mean, the description of your long lunch with Fidel Castro is pretty surreal and kind of sad considering what's happening in Cuba today.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed the book. Yeah, Cuba, you get a sense that Cuba's going to be next on the Trump agenda. I mean, they really, they've got to look, they got a bad economic system. The people there have really suffered, as have the people in Iran under a bad regime. And, economics, they haven't been really able to participate in the modern world. And now the whole country's having blackouts. The entire country's blacked out half the time. They're sort of a sitting duck for somebody to come in there with some kind of savior story. So we'll see how that plays out. But I have no doubt that, particularly with Marco Rubio, Cuba's going to be somewhere on our burner, although I don't see the Iran thing going away and making a lot of time available for that in the near future.
Well, just in closing, do you have hope for the country? Because it is a dark time, and people are depressed, and I feel like covering the news on a daily basis. I deliver the daily dose of doom, so I would welcome some optimism.
I'm with you. I mean, it's almost mind-boggling what's happening now. It's a really dark time. I remember another dark time in the 60s. We had all the political assassinations. We had the Vietnam War. We had the rise of Richard Nixon and the version of right-wing Republican politics back then. But, we kind of came out of it. There seemed to be an event with Watergate and the end of the war where all of a sudden the tables turned and we were able to continue to march forward. And, I really believe in the goodness of the American people. And I believe that they can't be fooled for so long, particularly when their economic interests and their political freedom they're more conscious of how poorly they're doing relative to what might have been.
Well, Tom Freston, I appreciate you and I appreciate your book, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ian. Nice to talk with you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And again, I've been speaking with Tom Freston, who's the co-founder of MTV and the former CEO of Viacom. After launching a successful clothing company out of Afghanistan and India in the 1970s, he transitioned into the media landscape, helping found MTV and bringing it to the international fame in more than 150 countries. And before Viacom's roles, he ran MTV Networks for 17 years, overseeing Nickelodeon, VH1, Comedy Central, and other legendary networks. He currently serves as board chair of the One Campaign, an anti-poverty advocacy organization focusing on Africa, and his latest book is Unplugged, Adventures from MTV to Timbuktu. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
One more light goes
goes on and